Great, thank you very much. So good afternoon to everyone there in Colorado. I'm very pleased to be able to talk about people's understanding of climate change adaptation. I also wanted to add my thanks to Adams as well, my appreciation to the organisers for enabling this virtual session. It's slightly strange being sat here in a slightly room with the rain outside in Cardiff, but it's really nice to know that our talks are being received over there in Colorado. So I hope I have some interesting and new ideas to convey to the conference on this topic. Right, my own research is in a similar sort of area to Adam's. It involves looking at public understanding of climate change. And I've done this in a number of different ways over the years. For example, looking at how people talk about climate change and analysing their discourse, as well as through some more experimental and survey-based methods. And it strikes me that the research over the past 20 years has tended to be dominated by two key themes. First of all, there's been a focus on what I've called on this slide epistemic matters, so concerning whether or not and why people believe in climate change, whether they accept it's real, whether they accept there's a human component, and their views on science and uncertainty. And secondly, I think there's been also a substantial focus, particularly within environmental psychology, on people's behaviours and choices and lifestyles, and increasingly their social practices, and relating to their support or opposition for policy measures. And what I wanted to talk about today, which is where I think there has been something of a gap in the literature to date, has been an examination of people's understanding of climate change adaptation. So there's been quite a bit of work in development studies and in policy research, and I noticed some of these talks and posters at the AGU conference. So there's been quite a bit of research in this area looking at how people understand and respond to adaptation. But I don't think we've really got to grips with how the broader public, particularly in the UK, the USA, the EU, so more developed nations, are likely to respond to adaptation and understand it as this becomes increasingly important over the next few years. So the sorts of questions that I'm interested in are things like, how is adaptation contrasted with mitigation in people's understanding? Is it seen as something which is desirable and feasible as a response to climate change? Is there a moral hazard in even talking about adaptation, by which I mean, if we start talking about adaptation, does that imply a shift away from mitigation? Have we now forgotten that we're trying to mitigate and lower emissions? And I think that's an important question. And also, what underpins people's attitudes towards climate change adaptation? So the research that I'm going to talk about today draws on three separate qualitative data sets spanning the period 2010 to 2012. Each of these projects had their own separate remits, so two of the projects were concerned particularly with people's views on geoengineering, but all of these three qualitative projects included a component in which people were asked for their perspectives and their thoughts on adapting to climate change. And in addition to this qualitative work, I'll also refer to some survey work that we ran at the very end of last year as well. So on to the discourse analysis of the qualitative research. Now, the first thing I noticed when I was looking across these separate projects that were run largely as separate entities is that often when you look at how people talk about adaptation in the discussion groups and the deliberative work, in many cases this was in quite a negative way. I use the word pejorative here because I sort of negative implies that there's a positive, that it should be positive or something. But it was, the implication was often in people's talk that this was interpreted in quite a negative manner. And the reason that I included the phrase "prevention is better than cure" in the title of this talk is that it seems to me that this is often the way that this negative interpretation of adaptation was done by people. So in the first quote here on this slide, you can see a participant talking about how they view adaptation as failing to address the root causes of climate change. And the comment that adaptation in this quote is just clearing up the mess you've made, I think it sums up quite nicely the view that this is something that's seen as being a measure taken after the event rather than sort of trying to address the causes. Also, in this second quote here, the participant suggests that failing to address causes means that we'll be required to constantly catch up, to build the wall ever higher, and that leads to a catch-22 situation. In a related way, within this same theme, people also suggest that adaptation conveys the impression of giving up on climate change. So, as this first person puts the matter, that there's an air of shuffling the pack or just trying to accommodate rather than actually taking what they would presumably see as more meaningful action. And the suggestion is also made that adaptation is something we do when we're stuffed, as this participant puts it, so when we're beaten at the end rather than being a solution in and of itself. This third person here, in response to a moderator question of why they disliked adaptation, directly refers to it as seeming very defeatist. So we can see there, again, the idea that then it's not being seen as a solution. And the sense of a moral hazard implicit in adaptation, which I was curious to see whether this would emerge from the research, and it did to an extent, it is also referred to by participants. So in the first quote on this slide here, the person suggests there is a risk of adaptation being turned into an excuse not to act. So we also had people talking about it as a stop or a cop-out. And likewise, this second person on the slide expresses a concern that adaptation seems rather like resignation or acceptance. So we're giving up the ghost with mitigation, and we've just got to live with this. We won't bother now because we can adapt to it. And the important thing, I think, to pick up on both of these quotes is the public recognition that an emphasis on adaptation at least presents the potential or the risk to detract from the importance of dealing with the causes of climate change. Now, the next couple of slides here actually look at how people have interpreted adaptation in a rather different way, as something which is considered both necessary and desirable. So as this first person mentions on this slide here, adaptation is not actually going to be a matter of personal choice anyway. Rather, it's something that's going to be imposed on us. We're going to be compelled to do, and so we're going to have to adapt to climate change. And in both the first and the second quote here, participants use this language of compulsion, of having to do something that we've got to adapt. So this is quite a different framing from the one that sees it as an alternative or a distraction from, say, mitigation. And people also refer, and I think this is quite interesting, to the idea that adaptation is something that humans are inherently suited to. So the first couple of quotes here come across to me like really rather general truths about humanity and human nature. So first of all, this participant's referring to the fact that we're able to adapt to everything. Change is inevitable. We can adapt to stuff. You hear people talking about we've been doing this throughout the human history. We adapt. That's what humans do. And secondly, almost in biological terms, referring to the fact that humans are a very adaptable species here. I also think it's interesting that adaptation in these discussion groups was related to the national character here. And so in this third quote here, you have the participant talking about this is just the way the British people are. We do adapt to things, and it's almost perhaps going too far to say it's sort of Churchillian, but it's kind of this suggestion of British people. We can adapt to stuff. We've got to stiff up a lip. And also this participant in the last quote here emphasises that when people, so that for example the people in York that they refer to, have faced the consequences of extreme weather, so flooding in this case, that they've been able to adapt to and respond to it. So that's all I wanted to say on the qualitative research. I'm going to move on to talk now about some survey findings from late last year. Now these data that I'm going to talk about come from some work which was done across Wales as part of the sorry, the phone was bleeping, but it stopped. Some work that was done across Wales for this Climate Change Consortium of Wales, which employs me. Now, Wales has a relatively small population, actually, relative to the rest of the UK. The population is about 3 million versus the population of the UK, which is about 63 million. So it's only a very small proportion of the population. But we use this survey to apply various measures relating to people's concern and views on climate change, as well as some measures specific to climate impacts and policies in Wales. And one novel part of this research that I was very interested to develop in a survey-based, a quantitative manner, was an attempt to try and gauge people's attitudes towards adaptation in both general and specific terms, because I hadn't seen very much, although there are some examples, very much of this in the literature. So the first slide here shows that in the most general sense, that there was, across the survey respondents, a very slight preference across the sample for mitigation over adaptation. Now, we framed this question as a forced choice, asking people to indicate whether they felt that it was more important for Wales to focus on adapting to the effects of climate change or to focus on reducing the causes. And we were careful also to present this choice both ways around, as shown on this slide, so as to account for the possibility that people might perhaps have just agreed with whichever statement we presented to them. So as you can see on the slide, we framed the question both ways round. Now, on the upper charts here, where the question framing puts adaptation first, then about 50% of people agree it's more important for Wales to adapt, with just under 40% disagreeing. However, where people are asked whether it's more important for Wales to reduce the causes of climate change than adapt to the effects, we find about 60% agree, with only around a quarter now disagreeing. So, as I say, these results would seem to indicate a slight preference across a representative population for mitigation over adaptation, at least in some very general terms. Now, another way of asking about people's preferences is to present a resource allocation question, which is shown here. So we asked people how they would split £100 between reducing causes or adapting to the effects of climate change. And as you can see here, the mean amount allocated was very close to the £50 midpoint. There was, however, quite a lot of variation across the respondents in where they chose to actually allocate the money. So when you run a regression looking at what sorts of climate change perceptions predict these preferences, there's quite a clear pattern, I think. So the table here shows which attitudes about climate change predict responses to this resource allocation question. The beta value in this table essentially shows how important each of these attitudes are relative to the others, and then there's a measure of statistical significance as well. Now, in this table, this actually shows predictors of preferences for mitigation, because this seemed to make more sense given that 3 of 4 of the values were positive. But what we can see is that both the belief that climate change has a human cause and the belief that there is a scientific consensus on climate change both predict a preference for mitigation over adaptation, whereas the view that the seriousness of climate change is exaggerated conversely predicts a preference for adaptation over mitigation. Now, particularly in the case of the belief that climate change has a human cause, there is a certain logic here that it hardly makes sense to apply resources to emissions reduction, for example, if you don't even believe that there is an anthropogenic component. But I do think it's also fair to say that these items represent what you might call a general acceptance of climate change as a legitimate concern. So if you see climate change as important and serious, then you will tend to favour mitigation. This chart is along similar lines to the ones I showed on the last slide, although I've shown here measures of more underlying world views and pro-environmental identity. Now, as Adam mentioned, various studies have shown that people's tendencies to prefer a different sort of political way of life predict things, not just people's attitudes towards climate change, but also to do with things like abortion and gun control. We know this from common sense, but also from more detailed work done by people like Dan Kahan. And it's sort of too simplistic, really, to divide these measures that I've got on this slide here, egalitarianism and individualism, as a sort of left-right distinction, but as a simple and blunt way of dividing this up, it'll do for now. And what we find is that preference for adaptation is also split along the lines of people's worldviews and environmental values. So people who are higher on individualism measures tend to favour adaptation, whereas those who are more egalitarian tend to favour mitigation, and people with a pro-environmental identity also favour mitigation. So in conclusion, from these results we can see that adaptation can be interpreted in some very different ways. It can be either interpreted in a negative and a defeatist way, or conversely in quite a pragmatic or positive or preferred manner. And it would seem to me that there are different arguments underlying each. Now, in previous research, these authors that I've mentioned here on this slide, Klinsky et al., these authors have shown that where people are reasoning about mitigation, then arguments about causation tend to be more important in that reasoning. For example, where people are thinking about burden sharing for emissions reduction. And by contrast, where people are reasoning about adaptation, then arguments about ability and need are more important. So, for example, where people are thinking about moral considerations of who should be helped to deal with climate impacts. Now, in the present study, I think my findings relate to this sort of interpretation, but I'd like to take a slightly different tack on this. And I'd suggest that an emphasis on mitigation seems to arise where climate change is seen as something which is preventable or avoidable. So in other words, the focus of attention is still on causes, but is on stopping or reducing the causes of climate change. And by contrast, adaptation seems to be emphasised where the focus of attention is on the need to deal with the impacts of climate change. And a related conclusion that might be drawn from the research is also that those who are more pro-environmental and accept the importance of climate change tend to be exactly those people who are of the view that it can and should be prevented, and so favour mitigation. By contrast, people who are more doubting perhaps don't worry about this and would favour adaptation. Now, there's a strong sense, and I think this is an area which warrants quite a bit of future research, and I've been surprised that maybe it's out there, but I've been surprised that I haven't been able to find too much on it. But the sense that these approaches, mitigation and adaptation, have the potential to be seen as being in conflict with each other, so the moral hazard argument. And when I was writing this presentation, I was reminded of a comment by Kalistas Juma, who is a professor of international development, and he was reflecting on resistance to attempts in the 1990s to develop climate adaptation, when this was seen as quite a sort of new idea. And what he said was that industrialized countries saw adaptation essentially as a cop-out. There was an assumption that to argue for adaptation is to acknowledge that global warming is going to happen. It's perceived as giving in. And I think those sorts of arguments can both be found in the research participants' comments and are also a risk for communication around adaptation. By contrast, there's also a recognition that adaptation is necessary, is something we're going to have to do, is common sense, and perhaps taps into a sort of can-do spirit. Participants' assertion is individual and collective efficacy. And I think it's an open question whether the sorts of barriers that we know can affect people's engagement with climate change apply in a similar way when talking about adaptation. So the problem of climate change being distant in space and time and complex and unintentionally caused, are these likely to apply in similar ways when we are looking at adaptation? So in conclusion, I wonder what sort of questions this raises about communicating adaptation to the wider public. And I'd like to finish off by suggesting some risks and opportunities for communication around adaptation. I think there's a risk of conveying the inappropriate message of giving in, which I've talked about. There's a risk of shifting attention away from mitigation. But there's also the opportunity to present a positive and practical message and to contextualise climate change as being something close to home. And there may even be the opportunity to engage some people who are unconvinced about mitigation. I'm going to wrap up there. I did have one more slide, but I see that the time is about 1:45 now, so I'll just quickly flash up this slide on the study limitations. So in terms of how this was framed as a tension between mitigation versus adaptation, and also to acknowledge that this was specifically a UK study. And I'll hand back, I think, to Steve, who is going to chair the questions. So thank you very much for having me.